If we look at the sheer array of classic inspired survival horror games that are coming out in the modern day, they do present themselves in many different styles. But the funny thing is, not all of the games, while they do take a lot of inspiration from the games of old, but they don't all use the same style. We are starting to see a lot more an influx of 2D pixelated horror games that on the face of it have some very interesting stories, dynamics, gameplay styles, and just some stunning visuals that do reflect classic horror games but do manage to put their own spin on it, and you can clearly see that with the artistic style that's present. This particular game, The Bugs Manor, which is a prologue to the full game that's still in development, which is hoping to be released sometime this year as of recording this video, which is kind of like a prelude to a story surrounding a haunted manor that is home to some very unusual demonic entities and monsters, pretty much like gigantic bugs. On the surface, the 2D pixel art is visually stunning. There's a lot of detail that has gone in here, and even with the character interactions, which sees you playing as 3 different characters that end up exploring the depths of this manor to try and figure out its backstory, but you quickly find out that all is not well with it. But the one thing I will say, the visuals aside, it is very dark, very atmospheric, and this is one brutally gruesome game, especially when you get into it later on. It's very visceral in its detail, and even with the 2D pixel art style, it's even more so. And the really cool thing about these type of games, yes, they are 2D, but they really are able to invoke not only nostalgia but a real sense of tension, ambience and atmosphere that even more mainstream and more high budget games can't seem to replicate, which is crazy when you think about it. But what's really cool is in this modern time, developers are now being that creative with their experiences that they're able to create what essentially should have been this style of format of horror games way back when, in the ages of 8 and 16-bit consoles. Because when we look back to the times of the likes of the NES and the Sega Master System, even the Mega Drive and the Super Nintendo, there was some form of horror games present, but they were very limited in their appeal, because what ended up happening is that any horror games that did come out on those platforms, usually they were kind of like ports or spin-offs of movies that were popular during the 80s and 90s, but they always usually came in some form of like either a beat 'em up format or a platforming style game. And really what it was is that essentially they weren't, you could say, horror games as such, even though they did have some horror elements, but really what they were doing is they had to try and depict the trends of the time, because at that period popular games would have come in the form of platformers, as they were pretty much the dominant force with video games. They were the highest sellers, you could say. So as a result, even horror games got that same treatment, pretty much as a platformer, but just with a horror kind of like theme or coat of paint on it. But it was very, very hard to depict horror. I think it kind of came down to one of two things, I think. Either developers didn't really know how to predict or anticipate the development of horror within video games, or that they were having to conform to higher budget standards, because very like today, where you've people in offices and corporate owners, fellas in black suits, where they dictate where the market's going to go, because all they care about is how much money they're going to make. They don't care about what works, all they care about is what money they can bring in. So if something is working, like say a platformer, or we'll make a horror game, but essentially it's just going to be a platformer with a horror coat of paint on it. And when you look at it in the grand scheme of things, that necessarily doesn't work. But luckily enough, with the indie scene, it does move away from that. It does allow for developers and creatives to really kind of move away from all of that conformity with AAA development in order to create something truly memorable and unique that really will leave an impact. If anything, like I said, this is the style of game that should have been on earlier systems, because when we go back, one of the only rare examples of that style that would have been seen like this would have come in the form of Sweet Home, that originated on the NES way back in the late 80s, which would have been the precursor to the now popular Resident Evil from Capcom. But what's really interesting about these type of games is how they're able to depict horror in the most visceral type of way, but also on the surface looks like a real dedicated piece of art, but with a lot of elements that are hidden under the surface, which you won't really see until you get into these games later on. And this game does show that in great detail, which starts off like the role of 3 characters that are pretty much young kids or teenagers, and they want to explore this manor knowing that it's predominantly haunted, although they don't think that it is in the beginning. But the youngest of the 3 characters, as she's a young kid, she's kind of almost enticed or pushed into the scenario which she doesn't feel comfortable in, almost like peer pressure, because she wants to fit in with the group and she feels like that she's going to be missing out if she doesn't do it. So in an act of bravery, goes to try and prove her friends wrong by trying to enter the house and trying to let them know that she isn't scared. But it ends up that she gets caught up and kind of like has to hide due to those fears because she knows something's not right, which leads to a drastic turn of events where the other two characters end up going into the house in search for her but can't find her, only to realise that the whole element of the aura of the house that originally was there has completely changed, and it's like as if you're in a completely different environment or realm which is now haunted by creatures that do hunt down people or anything that they find. And that's where the game really goes into its dark format. Now, when you go to play this particular prologue, it will take you roughly between 15 and 20 minutes to complete, give or take, but it really does give you a good synopsis as to the overall story. But it is very dark, atmospheric, and visceral in terms of its violence. You will end up having to use stealth in order to try and avoid enemy conflicts, because if enemies see you and if they get to you, you're gone. They will just rip you to shreds. But the elements here definitely lead to what could be really interesting when the full game is released, hopefully at some point. It's a very interesting game, I have to say. And this is another example that really showcases that 2D horror games are just as scary as anything else out there, and we've seen that with previous examples that have released in recent times, even going back as far as The Dead of Darkness, which I have covered in a previous video, which is now also available not only on Steam but on modern consoles with the likes of the PlayStation. And it's a very, very popular game, and if you like classic Resident Evil, you'll absolutely love it. I have to say now, I thought it was really, really good. Very dark, atmospheric, very gritty, very violent, but even the pixel graphics don't take away from the ambience and atmosphere that it presents, and this here, the Bugs Manor, feels very like that as well. Now, somewhat on a smaller scale, but it definitely manages to capture that atmosphere. It really leaves you just creeped out and even just filled with tension throughout the experience, as you do have to solve a variety of different puzzles, you have to explore all of the environments, and you just have to be aware of your surroundings at all times to avoid any dangers. But the best way to experience it would be to play it yourself. That's why I don't want to give too much away. You will have to experience it just to see what you think. But survival horror doesn't always have to be of the classic style that we're familiar with from the likes of the PS1 era. It can come in many shapes and forms, as we see with this now today, and they're definitely worth a look. A very unique experience, definitely worth playing. Again, there's a demo link below on Steam that you can check out. I would highly recommend you give it a go. With that being said, however, I would love to know your thoughts of this. What do you think of it yourself? Are you a fan of this style of 2D horror that is showing up in more recent times, and what do you think of it overall? Do you think it's a good basis or a good alternative to classic survival horror? So be sure to share it in the comments below. And if you would like to see more content of even more of these 2D style horror games that are appearing, you can check out this next video right here.